Hello, my name is Admiral Winslow, and for most of my life, my family treated me like I was invisible. My brother wore the spotlight while I was dismissed as someone who probably retired early. What they never knew was that I carried 27 years of silent service, unseen victories, and sacrifices I could never speak of. And then came the day that silence ended when a general turned to the entire room and introduced me, not as the forgotten sister, but as Rear Admiral Winslow. That was the moment truth finally spoke louder than their doubts. My brother's laughter filled the room. Mine barely reached the rim of my teacup. The table glittered with too much silver and sunlight. Bacon-snapped strawberries glistened, coffee steamed in a French press that only I refilled. I held my cup with both hands and let the heat rest in my palms, steady, unnoticed against the noise. Dorian sat at the head as if the chair belonged to him. He launched his story before the butter softened, how a resupply run nearly collapsed off Coronado, how he improvised the route, how the crew learned what leadership sounds like. He swapped voices, imitated a panicking ensign, thumped the table at the punchline. Selena's laugh arrived on cue. Malcolm nodded, pleased. I sliced a pear, too finely listening for the facts beneath his theater. There were a few always, but the rhythm of his telling blurred the edges. The story wore medals over stitches. Command presence, he said, savoring the phrase. You either have it or you make coffee. His grin flicked my way like a porch light, not to welcome but to fix my place. I set the pear by the toast rack and asked if anyone wanted milk. No one answered. A bead slid down the glass and vanished into the saucer. He moved on a minor equipment failure that under his hand became a parable about composure. Celine touched his sleeve as if he'd come in from a storm. Malcolm cleared his throat. That's steadiness, he said. That's our name. The word our caught behind my ribs. I watched the maple sway beyond the window. The world outside went on unbriefed now. Dorian poured orange juice and with a practiced smile turned toward me. Probably retired early, right, Ilara? The room was bright. I let the question rest on the white cloth between jam jars and crumbs. Still working? I said. The spoon in my cup tapped once, small as a sonar ping. He made a sympathetic face that carried nothing but satisfaction. Behind the desk, then. Must be nice, no 2 a.m. reports, no brass breathing down your neck. Celine nodded, like people nod at a forecast that spares their picnic. Malcolm folded his napkin like a flag and looked at me over the top of it. Brains are fine, he said, warm with authority, but heroes carry the family legacy. Silence arranged the dishes into a neat little army. I put the milk away, rinsed. The knife wiped a constellation of crumbs into my palm. A drip ticked in the sink. Sunlight climbed cabinets by an inch. I thought of rooms I'd walked through without leaving a shadow. Maps I'd held while other people held microphones. Nights I'd counted by bandwidth, not stars. Heat left my cup. The china cooled. Dorian resumed, satisfied, as if scene had landed where the script wanted it. He spoke about schedules and metrics and keeping the machine humming. No one asked what I did. The French press sighed. A private steadiness rose behind my sternum. It didn't ask for the room. It didn't need to. It took its seat and waited for the horizon to turn. My phone buzzes with an encrypted message. Operation Triton Command Briefing. Full honors. May 17th. Pentagon. They thought I kept spreadsheets. In truth, I kept the sea from burning. The memory opens like a hatch vents, humming, no windows, green cursors in a room that forgot the sun. 12 years earlier, I wore a badge that listed no job, only where not to take it. They called us analysts. We lived on coffee and pattern noise. Desk job, Dorian liked to say. Those nights I stayed late, letting the world narrow to spectra and ping trees until pride went quiet. The sea spoke in distances, decimals that read wrong by a hair could cost a ship. The alert arrived thin as a cough. A humanitarian freighter crossed east of Okinawa, transponder clean, chatter normal. But the sonar frame around it wore a seam, a wash of interference, repeating every 11.4 seconds, not random, not weather. I asked for a second pass. A petty officer reran the filter. The seam returned like a bruise. Probably cable drag, someone said. The unnamed commander slid beside me, face gone gray with screens. Show me the delta. I widened the gate, damped the bin, and the wash resolved into a faint tooth, an echo just below our map cruising parallel with patience. Unflagged, close. We didn't shout, we layered. Satellite drift AIS ghosts, a fishing fleet whose pattern didn't match the season. The tooth nudged closer to the freighter's belly. I felt it the way you feel a storm through glass. Recommend intercept posture, I said. The commander kept his voice level. On whose authority? The petty officer looked between us. On mine, until yours, I said, and my fingers moved before certainty could evaporate. We ghosted our presence-fed noise, here tugged current, there bled a rumor through a partner's channel that the corridor was fouled with survey debris. The freighter's course bent 1.5 degrees starboard. The tooth adjusted hunting. We dropped a packet into the sea of lies, a fabricated contact 2 miles south, big enough to interest a predator. The tooth twitched. Confirm, the commander asked. The petty officer's scope drew a second curve, the predator pursuing the shadow we laid out for it, slipping away from the freighter with hunger. 12 sailors on that freighter would never know the ocean had tilted to spare them. It was a minute then, a silence we filed. The freighter cleared the corridor. The tooth drifted toward our decoy and dissolved into open water. I typed the notes, stripped my name to initials like everyone else, and stamped the packet with the mark that locks stories. By morning, another office would brief a safer ocean. Our room would go unmentioned. That was the point, I told myself, as if purpose could stand in for credit. When we finally stood, the commander shook my hand in a hallway where no plaques hung. Good work, he said. No medal. No speech. Just the door sighing shut and quiet, returning to a place designed for it. Years later, people laughed at brunch and asked whether I missed the action. They talked about waves like scenery. I remembered a seam that wasn't weather and the tooth under the map, and how we fed it a dream so it would not devour a name. I hold the memory like a coin, warm until it cools, turning it as time ticks. In my current office, the vents sound the same. The coffee is better, the stakes unchanged. I still count by decimals when the world looks away. I still believe in the relief of a ship that never learns it was almost a headline. The vents keep time steady. Back in the present, General Cassian Holt tells me no more shadows. Some victories are silent. Some stars wait in velvet until the right dawn. The room held its breath the way only empty walls can. My apartment had never worn decoration. No portraits, no polished frames, no clutter beyond the low bookshelf in the corner. The lamps gave off a faint amber soft enough to erase corners. I sat at the edge of the bed, with a box resting on my knees, its weight negligible, its meaning unbearable. The velvet case had lived in my closet since the day the promotion orders arrived. I never opened it when others were around. To admit what it contained felt like announcing a secret too large for the air. Tonight, the hinges gave way with a whisper, and the cloth inside revealed 2 points of silver light stars, sharp as ice, heavy as years. I let my fingertips linger against them, feeling the cool bite, the quiet they carried. I slid one free set-it on the navy shoulder board and pressed until the clasp clicked. The sound was tiny but definitive, the punctuation of 27 years compressed to a second. The second star followed neat and deliberate twin emblems of authority I had earned in silence. I rose, crossed to the mirror propped carelessly against the wall. The uniform, untouched until now, straightened itself across my shoulders as if it had been waiting for this evening alone. My reflection startled me. not for the decorations, but for the steadiness in my eyes. I had spent so many years keeping them lowered, watching meetings unfold, watching applause flow towards someone else's grin. Now the fabric carried my weight without strain, the stars glinting with calm defiance. Holt's words whispered again, "It's time they see who held the line." I turned to the bookshelf. On its middle shelf sat the only photograph I kept visible. A squad of us, younger, dirt-smudged and wide with laughter after an op that never made the news. No medals, no citations, just proof of breath shared and survived. I traced the edge of one face long gone now, then set the photo back carefully. My lips curved into a faint smile, softer than pride, warmer than nostalgia. It was acknowledgement of the people who carried me when no one else noticed I was carrying them. The quiet deepened. I drew a long breath, shoulders squared beneath the new weight. Not for applause, I whispered to the room, my voice as measured as any order I had ever given. For presence. The words settled like anchor chains. At the desk, the glow of the secure terminal pulsed a reminder that ceremony was never just ceremony. I opened the schedule for the May 17th briefing, scrolling past logistics and protocol lines until the speakers appeared. There it was, Commander Dorian Winslow Joint Readiness Overview. His name stared at me in bold type, as if it had been waiting to step in front of mine again. My pulse steadied instead of spiking. The screen flickered, the stars on my shoulders caught the light, and silence once again filled the apartment. This time not hollow, but full of intent. I checked the briefing schedule. Dorian is also listed as a speaker for May 17th. He boasted of his triumph. I remembered writing every line of it. 7 years earlier, the council chamber smelled of stale coffee and polished brass. The overhead lights hummed, bouncing off screens that mapped trouble across the Pacific. I had worked 42 hours straight the week before, sifting through intercepted chatter, mapping vessel routes, weighing the risk of escalation if the wrong convoy cut too close to disputed waters. My report had grown like a lattice satellite captures logistics tables, predictive models all tied together by margins that whispered where the storm would break. I knew the document by heart. I had built it alone in silence. Yet when the meeting began, Dorian strode to the podium as if the report had always been his shadow. He carried the folder with a casual flourish, spread the pages on the stand, and adjusted the microphone with that easy grin he wore like a medal. My chair was against the wall where the assistants sat, anonymous and replaceable. "Gentlemen, ladies," Dorian began, his voice, steady, resonant, rehearsed. "We face a potential flashpoint, but our posture will ensure stability." He tapped the map that I had annotated line by line. Every figure, every forecast, every cautious recommendation left my pen first. He converted them into theater. He waved his hand across the room, punctuated sentences with confident pauses, tilted his head just so, command presence they called it. The officers leaned forward, pens poised, believing the cadence belonged to him. I clenched my own pen until my hand ached. I could almost recite his lines before he spoke them. He described his insight into convoy, pacing, his recognition of a smuggling corridor disguised as fishing traffic, his foresight to recommend rerouting to avoid escalation. The words wrapped the council in calm assurance. I watched silent, the ghostwriter of a speech I would never deliver. Cellini wasn't there then, but Malcolm's praise later would echo. That's how leadership sounds. They never asked who calculated the probabilities, who heard the risk beneath static. They only heard his timbre, strong and unflinching. At the table's end, a senior officer leaned back, eyes narrowed in respect. "Brilliant foresight, Commander Winslow." The words cut deeper than any insult. Applause followed, sharp and official. My throat tightened with a taste I had swallowed too many times, metallic like ink and restraint. The session ended. Folders closed, officers filed out with nods and murmurs. Dorian clasped hands, collected praise, basked in an orbit of admiration. I stacked my notes into a plain envelope, slipped them into my bag, and walked out without a sound. In the hallway, the echoes of clapping still rang, though my footsteps swallowed them whole. Years later, that day returns whenever I smell burnt coffee or see light bouncing off polished tables. The memory sits beside me like an uninvited guest, reminding me that silence can preserve dignity, but also erase existence. Now in the present, General Cassian Holt looks me straight in the eye. His voice is quiet, deliberate, sharpened by certainty. At the ceremony, no humility. You will stand. Every step downward felt like leaving the world above for the truth below. The elevator to sublevel 3 breathed like a lung doors, sealing us away from weather and opinion. May 16th sat cold on my watch. Holt stood beside me without conversation, his reflection a dark shoulder over mine in the brushed metal. As the car sank, pressure gathered in my ears, not pain, just a reminder that air behaves differently where truth is stored. Somewhere above us, the city exhaled. Down here, intention replaced weather and talk. The corridor received us with white light and tile. Security officers checked badges, then checked the check's eyes, impersonal. The hum down here wasn't electricity so much as intent, the layered pulse of servers and air. I matched my breathing to it. Years had taught me that rhythm steadies the body. We passed doors named only by numbers. I had walked this grid 100 times, unnoticed, ghosting from brief to brief, handing shaped facts to people who loved microphones. Tonight, the silence sounded expectant. Holt's steps were unhurried. He glanced at me once and said low and even, "You built this. Now you own it." The sentence turned a lock inside me. I thought of maps spread over midnight of relief without audience of the years I tuned myself small so the work could be large. I didn't need applause. I needed the door to open. A turn, another checkpoint, then a narrower hall where the paint still smelled new. My hand brushed the wall as if touching a hull. Holt flashed clearance. The guard's voice clicked through the intercom, then the lock withdrew. Inside, the air grew cooler and the ceiling higher. Sound thinned. We entered the auditorium from the side catwalk above the seats. Empty rows faced the stage like calm water. Flags were already posted. Their colors waited. Microphones waited with their red eyes dimmed. A single lectern stood center. Holt stopped where the sightline sharpened. From here, I could see everything that would see me tomorrow: the absent press pool, the brass rail, the aisle that might carry a wave of standing bodies if the moment deserved it. I rested my hands on the railing. It was cold. "You'll come in from stage right," Holt said. "I will finish the readiness segment, then pivot. No fanfare. Precision matters even in ceremony." He studied the lectern, measuring distance. Lights warmed, then dimmed as a tech cycled systems. Wires lay in loops. A security officer crossed the floor, tested a mic, and vanished. I studied the path I would walk: 13 steps to the lectern if I kept an even cadence. I counted them twice, then practiced breathing. Holt's hand touched the rail beside mine, not reassurance, more alignment. "Whatever they thought you were," he said, "falls away the moment you stand there." I nodded. Memory stirred, but the room had already made up its mind. We descended to the floor. Up close, the flags seemed taller, the fabric denser. I checked the lectern's height, adjusted nothing, pictured my notes as emptiness. Above us, the catwalk lights cooled, ticking. I walked the aisle twice. On the second pass, I let an invisible audience assemble: officers, partners, skeptics. The old ache visited and left. The room did not belong to it. Holt checked his watch. The hour had settled into decision. He faced the stage, jaw set not in severity but in resolve, and spoke in a voice that preferred action to theory. "Tomorrow, when I turn, I will name you." The Pentagon's walls hummed louder than my brother's applause. I let the morning carry me down the bright spine of the building, one body inside a river of uniforms, badges, and paper cups. May 17 felt tuned, doors sighed. Scanners blinked, and polite voices braided into a practiced chorus. Names moved through the air like pennants. Dorian's moved most, It drew salutes across the corridor as if the wall itself were introducing him. A commander caught his eye and grinned. Their handshake cut cleanly through the traffic and then reformed behind me as if I were only air. The hum in the paneling was constant and indifferent work's long metronome keeping time beneath applause. A pair of captains flanked Dorian for 30 paces, the word leadership turning in their mouths like a coin. A public affairs aide laughed at something he said. I stepped out of their wake to make room for a dolly of equipment. The aide's glance slid past me the way a map ignores its margin. From a side hall, Commander Reed appeared steady as I remembered. He didn't break stride. "Good to see you here, Admiral," he said, simple level a sentence that belonged to knowledge instead of rumor. I answered with a nod, small enough to pass for breath. The corridor narrowed near the auditorium wing. 2 junior officers hovered at my 6 voices veiled by lids and steam. "Didn't she quit years ago?" one asked. The other gave a laugh designed to be forgotten. Heat found the heel of my right hand and stayed there. I kept the folder pressed flat and let the comment float forward until it dissolved. Up ahead, someone else greeted Dorian by rank and first name at once. He stood a half-inch taller without moving a tell I had known since he was 16. The ache that memory brings arrived, looked around, and left. The wall resumed its even music. I used a slice of quiet by a logistics kiosk to open my laptop. The screen lifted like a visor. Behind the familiar gate waited a report with no public lineage, assembled one night at a time until the spine held timestamps, probabilities, the margin where a safer route first appeared. Unfiled, not hidden, kept whole until the day truth could carry itself. My hand unclenched on the keyboard. A breath reset the ribcage. I closed the lid to let the metronome return. The crowd thickened at the doors. Reed vanished into the wings. An officer rehearsed a sentence under her breath. A camera operator walked backward, testing focus. Dorian's laugh surfaced and fell. I moved through the sound without friction and counted my steps to keep the room from assigning me a place. Lowest points rarely look dramatic from the outside. They are the second you accept what the hallway thinks and decline to live there. Past the junction, a mural of ships marched along the wall. I traced a destroyer's outline with my eyes and felt old math stack itself tonnage draft the way steel rides weather. A colonel swept by with a whispering entourage. They bent around Dorian like water around rock, then straightened as if nothing had moved. Reed's greeting lingered small and solid, reminding me some rooms remember accurately, even when the loudest ones do not. The ductwork shifted. The hum dropped half a note as if the building took a long breath and chose to hold it. By the doors, a staff sergeant practiced raising and lowering a velvet rope until the motion seemed invisible. Readiness, no one claps for now. My phone trembled once. The glass showed a single line spare, and certain the way weather is said when it matters. Holt texts, "Stay sharp. The moment is close." He thrived under lights. I waited in shadows. The house lights softened the edges of uniforms and the stage sharpened them again. From the wing I could see the front rows, NATO ribbons like constellations, press pens, ready brass arranged by precedence. The lectern gleamed. Dorian owned the center the moment his shoe found the sweet spot of the floor. He greeted the room with a smile that remembered its lines, rolled his shoulders, and let confidence bloom like a flag. He began on readiness numbers, polished to sound effortless drills distilled into stories. He balanced acronyms with punchlines, tossed in a comic impression of an ensign who confused 2 call signs, then righted the tale with a lesson about composure. Laughter arrived in neat waves, the kind that stays within margins but still warms the air. Cameras nodded with patience. A notebook scratched, another camera light winked. The hall liked him. From the back rows, a low murmur braided through the lights, the consent of briefings I had watched since cadet days. It rose, eddied, settled, a tide that lifts presenters and leaves quiet work beneath the waterline. Behind the curtain, I settled my breath through the ribs and down to the floor. I measured the distance to the lectern again, letting the knowledge cool. Holt stood near the stairs, gaze unreadable. My name lived in his mouth like a charge not yet thrown. On stage, Dorian paced, hands open, head tilted, every motion kept. He spoke about force posture, partner confidence, how leadership is a relay, not a monologue, and somehow made it sound like a monologue anyway. A map unfurled behind him, oceans tinted a diplomatic blue. He pointed to corridors I had helped quiet without leaving fingerprints. No one here knew what the quiet had cost. Row 3, Malcolm bent toward Celine. His voice only had to cross a seat. Finally, our legacy continues. Celine's hand found his sleeve, a small coronation. Certainty traveled back to me like heat from stage lamps. The story, as they told it at home, had reached its crowning chapter. Dorian modulated a pilot trimming altitude to keep the ride clean. He praised teams he could name and teams he could not. He cited our family's decades in uniform, a line crafted for cameras. He wore the narrative like a dress uniform, pressed and absolving. People leaned in to be near the orbit. I steadied my breathing. Shadows have their own acoustics. They return what matters and swallow the rest. I counted the beats of the house system, let them mark the seconds. The smell of cable insulation and starch, the faint mineral note of stage dust, details that survive when applause blurs. He cued a slide on drills. Jokes landed. Heads nodded. A journalist's bracelet chimed against a tablet. Someone in the aisle whispered a headline. Holt shifted his weight a fraction, a tide turning. I kept my hands at my sides. The curtain brushed my sleeve like a reminder to remain invisible 1 minute longer. Dorian reached his rhetorical crest. Whoever commands Triton will stand behind them. He let the sentence hover, as if modesty visited for effect, as if the hall should reassure him by shouting the obvious. It did, with applause, tidy as a parade, steady claps. He closed the folder and stepped back, chin high, receiving the room's answer. Holt stepped into the light, each footfall measured. He touched the lectern as though testing its balance, and looked out across the faces, then to the wing where I stood. His voice was calm, even carrying the plain weight of truth about to be spoken. This is more than a briefing. It is a transition. One turn of a general's head rewrote 27 years of silence. May 17th wore the bright theater of official days. Heat from the lights gathered in the rafters. Badges flashed like small suns. The stage smelled faintly of cable and starch. From the wing, I could see the hall settle, rows of uniforms, translators with headsets, cameras balanced on shoulders, a ripple of expectation that ran the length of the aisles and returned to the lectern like surf. Holt stood there as if the floor had been measured for him, hands easy on the edges, eyes scanning not for approval, but for alignment. He began with the formalities the schedule required: voice, even pace, unhurried. The room matched his tempo. I listened to my own breath landing between his sentences, steady as a metronome I could carry in my ribs. I thought of the corridors beneath us where air hummed over servers and classified cables, of all the times I had lived in that hum and watched other people stand in the light. I thought of the velvet case and the 2 clicks, the way fabric had accepted weight without protest. Then Holt made the smallest of pivots, shoulders angling toward the audience, chin lifting a degree. In that turn, the temperature changed. The hall felt it. I felt it like a current. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Command of Triton will fall under Rear Admiral Winslow. My name cut cleanly through the room. The first sound after it was not applause. It was the hush of people choosing what to believe. I stepped from the wings because that is what a commander does when called. No hurry, no drag heels, finding the path I had counted last night. Uniform crisp stars catching the lamps, I let my gaze pass over the front rows without landing. Dorian's face had gone still, the kind of still that belongs to a suddenly accurate map. Malcolm's jaw softened. Celine's hands found each other. The stage received my weight as if it had been expecting me. I stopped at the lectern's right shoulder and faced Holt. He nodded once, a motion that held both acknowledgement and instruction, then stepped back. Silence deepened until I could hear the cooling of the lights. Row 3, left aisle. Lieutenant Rowan Vega stood. He stood with the care of a man remembering the first time someone believed in him. His right hand came up clean and sharp. The salute hung alone for a heartbeat, and in that beat, the room made up its mind. A captain rose 5 seats down. A Marine colonel followed. The wave moved outward row by row like wind pressing grain until the field becomes a single body. Metal whispered where belt buckles lifted. Chairbacks thudded soft against knees. Camera operators froze lenses lowered by instinct they could not explain. I brought my hand up in return, crisp as a blade, and the air seemed to level. For a fraction of a second, I saw the whole, the years of corridors, the reports with no signature, the quiet reroutes that spared names from grief. I saw the way presence can speak without volume, the way a turn of a head can reassign gravity. I let my arm fall, and the room followed. A collective breath exhaled into new weather. Holt's gaze met mine again. No smile, only the faintest release in the set of his shoulders. Behind the front row, a NATO observer wrote something on a card and slipped it into a pocket. Somewhere far back, a journalist lowered a question he had been polishing. My stars caught the light once more and went still. I stepped to the microphone. The hall waited not for theater but for command. I adjust the microphone. Good morning. As of 0900, I have assumed operational command of Triton. The silence finally broke, but the reckoning has only just begun. Subscribe now, so you won't miss what happens when the storm truly arrives. I didn't raise my voice. I honed it. The lectern was warm under my palms, the air bright with expectation, and yet the weight I felt came not from 1,000 eyes but from 2 silver stars pressing the past into my shoulders. I straightened the microphone and let the quiet steady itself around us. The hall listened. Close. Our mission is not provocation, it is precision. I let the sentence land without embroidery. Heads lifted. Silence leaned forward as if to hear the next cut. We won't gamble with force to look strong. We will structure clarity so strength is unquestionable. Precision denies chaos its purchase. Precision saves lives. Behind me, the map traced contested corridors in cool blues. I tapped once, 2 fingers deliberate. Forward surveillance, information disruption, full tactical readiness. Each layer must echo the others until confusion has nowhere to live. My voice held even. My breath kept time with the house system's hum. Stage right, General Holt didn't move, but the corner of his mouth softened the closest he comes to approval. A French liaison scribbled, then passed a note. A Marine colonel fixed his gaze on the chart and did not blink. I met faces from nations that trust slowly, and saw in them the calculation that precedes assent. Trust is the currency of command, I said. I expect excellence, and I give trust in return. That is my contract beginning today. I let my hands open over the lectern, not pleading, not dramatic, simply present. I have lived my career in the architecture of presence, the kind that holds without noise. I closed the folder. Nothing more needed saying. The room became a held breath. A verdict had to choose its direction. The first clap came from the right aisle, single precise as a metronome tick. Another followed from the left. The sound traveled in measured beats, never frantic, never theatrical, until it filled the room with order. It wasn't the roar my brother loved. It was unanimity made audible. In its rhythm, I heard recognition not of a personality, but of a plan that would not waste lives for optics. I bowed my head a degree, acknowledging what they offered, and let the applause crest and fall. When the last reverberation dissolved, quiet possessed the hall again. Our work would demand coordination without vanity. Our partners would test us with questions sharper than applause. I welcomed both. I could already feel the lattice forming: watch, assess, decide, act, review. Repeat until the sea remembered what calm looked like. Holt's stillness grew eloquent. He had bet on presence over theater, and the room had answered. I saw it in the way shoulders dropped out of guarded posture, in the way notebooks closed with decisions already made. On the aisle, a British Commodore tapped a pen against her knee and smiled quick and private as if a long sum had just balanced. Across the third tier, notebooks closed with decisions squared and dated. A translator murmured approval. Another officer underlined a word: precision. Exactly. Malcolm stared at his folded program. Selini's hands intertwined. Clarity is not softness, I said. It is the refusal to let noise draft our orders. The sentence belonged to every night I had spent turning interference into signal. Around the hall, uniforms shifted the way trees do when wind changes altitude barely and yet undeniably. I ended where I had begun with discipline. Then I let the silence stand at attention beside me. It held. Then the hands began again, precise, unanimous, the sound of a decision choosing its shape. I lifted my eyes to the first row and found the face I had shared dinner tables and childhood ceilings with, a face that once mistook volume for command. The practiced grin was gone. Pride so easy in him had nowhere to stand. The stage at last refused to echo his certainties. He had lines prepared for every imaginable day but this one. I glanced at Dorian, his eyes, red lips tight, unable to respond. He chased me with ribbons rattling as if they could weigh more than truth. Fluorescent light flattened the hallway into glare and tile. I walked fast enough to feel the carpet seams under my heels, slow enough to look unhurried. Doors breathed. A vending machine hummed. Alara, wait. The call struck the back of my neck. I stopped because commanders don't flee and because some reckonings require stillness. Dorian came into view with ceremonial swagger reduced to motion, ribbons knocking softly, jaw tight. You never told me. His voice had edges it saved for strangers. I met it with the plain tone that never needed a mic. You never asked. The words stood between us like a border neither of us had drawn. He blinked, recalibrating. That's not fair, he said softer. At Dad's at brunch I thought you were done. Retired early. Behind a desk. Behind a desk, I echoed, is where you keep the maps that keep ships alive. You liked the podium. I liked the work. He swallowed. The ribbons tapped once, a metronome losing time. I thought I was the one out front, he said. I thought. You thought a lot, I said. But you didn't look. He flinched, and some old game between us fell silent. We were two officers in a white corridor where truth arrives without cameras. He tried again. Do you, was this all? Why didn't you say anything? Because classified isn't a costume, I said. Because some victories expire when you explain them. Because the work wanted quiet more than I wanted applause. His shoulders sagged a degree. I wouldn't have mocked you, he said, and even he heard it before I answered. The brunch table rose, probably retired early. I let the picture pass and kept breathing. He stepped closer, as if proximity might grant a rehearing. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Sitting there and hearing your name? I do, I said. It felt like the map finally included the terrain. We stood in the hum. Far off, a service cart clicked. Two ensigns turned a corner, saw our faces, and retreated. I was proud, he said, then rushed and angry at myself and embarrassed. It was like watching a ship I'd been bragging about and only then learning who built it. You don't have to be embarrassed, I said. You just have to do better. He nodded, eyes glassy. The ribbons went still. Tell me one thing, he said. Not the classified parts. Just enough to fix the story in my head. I considered the ceiling tiles, the paint seams, the way institutions hide their joints. There were nights, I said, when a decimal kept a city from waking to sirens. There were days when a rumor placed a predator where it would chase a ghost. And there were years when the right thing to do was let someone else take a bow so the room would stay calm. He listened without interrupting. Perhaps for the first time, silence sat with him and didn't feel like defeat. I can live with not knowing everything, he said finally. I can't live with not seeing you. Then look, I said. Not up at the lights. Across. He laughed once, broken but true. I deserved that. He straightened, then didn't chase the pose. Sister. He added a word we rarely used in uniform congratulations. He opened his mouth as if to apologize, then thought better of it. Restraint rare in him felt like a beginning we had never had. I nodded. The fluorescent hum found its old pitch. Somewhere a door chimed, counting down to the next brief. We had both run out of speeches, which might have been the point. Alara's phone buzzes text from Malcolm. Didn't know. I see it now. Proud of you. The world speculated. I left them one line to repeat. The apartment held a hush that cameras could never film. Streetlight made a pale ladder across the floorboards. The television washed the walls in headlines restless as tide. Chirons argued, surprise appointment. A new doctrine who is Rear Admiral Winslow clips, rolled of the auditorium lights, flags my uniform crossing the stage like a verdict delivered without theatrics. I kept the sound low subtitles marching across faces that preferred noise. Producers loved the phrase sudden rise as if decades could be compressed into a jump cut. Panels convened to guess which admiral backed me, which faction would claim me, what message this sent to allies who read nuance like weather. They cut to Dorian at a corridor microphone. He looked smaller without a podium to lean on. No comment on personnel decisions, he told, the scrum voice steady, but pulled tight at the edges. A reporter pressed had my appointment surprised him. He blinked, then chose a sailor's escape route. We'll follow the chain. The clip ended on a freeze frame where surprise still showed around the eyes. Producers loved that too. Missed calls, stacked congratulations, curiosity calculations. I answered none. Holt's counsel from the night before threaded through the hush stand, straight swerve for nothing. Discipline prefers silence. I let it hold. In the bottom crawl, someone quoted an unnamed source describing me as technical. Technical had always been the polite word for invisible. I let it pass. Precision is patient. It wins by letting weather exhaust itself. At 21:07, I opened a draft window and wrote exactly what the moment required. No adjectives, no reaching for applause. Our mission is not provocation, it is precision. I read the sentence once aloud. It balanced. I sent it to public affairs with one instruction: no follow-ups, no elaboration, release as is. The statement bled into the crawl within minutes. An anchor repeated it cleanly, then again. Another network cut the line into a lower third graphic beside maritime charts. A late-night show tried to riff, found no handhold, and let the words stand. Analysts pivoted. Their verbs lost heat. Precision became a key the panelists used to unlock calmer nouns, posture, steadiness, deterrence. I walked the apartment, letting the glow move across framed silence. The single squad photo, the velvet case put away. The coat I had ironed myself. Outside, a siren rose and fell, then distance turned it into memory. The television cycled through maps. Captions repeated the sentence as if it had always existed, as if it had simply been retrieved from a manual everyone meant to read. Just before 10, the tone on the international desk shifted. A European outlet ran a sidebar precision doctrine. An Asia-Pacific feed softened a headline that had been flirting with the word standoff. A think tank guest conceded that the new commander's language lowered the temperature without lowering resolve. Small changes visible if you've trained your eyes to see them the way a helmsman reads a degree of turn by feel. I muted the room and listened to the vents, the same faithful hum that had scored the Black Room years ago. Power lives there where volume recedes and clarity survives. I set the mug in the sink, wiped the ring from the counter, and let the quiet rebuild its scaffolding inside my ribs. The phone buzzed once. Holt texts me. Your words already changed the tone abroad. Respect sometimes lives in the back row, silent but steady. Pentagon Auditorium breathed its ordered air programs stacked like flags, brass polished. I took a seat on the last row where the lights forget to flatter one step above the aisle. From here, the stage looked smaller, just boards and light. Young officers filed in sleeves, knife-pressed. Shoes whispered discipline. A band tester sent one clean note across the rafters. I folded my hands. Anonymity settled like a regulation jacket. The back row is where respect takes inventory. Dorian stepped to the lectern with a smaller radius than before, as though the stage had been resized. He looked rested, dignified, the flourish gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice even. His remarks were polished thanks to training chiefs' drill highlights, praise for families. The room answered with quiet nods. Jokes were shorter, careful, sanded of swagger. I watched candidates rehearse pride in their shoulders. One barely older than Rowan held his breath for a classmate's name, then exhaled. Ritual never runs out of meaning. It only needs the right amount of light. Behind a half-raised camera, I felt the old urge to vanish the bargain between usefulness and visibility. That bargain no longer owned me, though it had left its furniture in my bones. Mid-hall, Malcolm sat with a program folded on his knee. His hands were still. Celine's posture was attentive, not curatorial. The room made space for their recalibration. It takes less energy to change your mind than to maintain a myth once air is cleared. On stage, Dorian's voice settled. He named a petty officer who kept a drill from becoming an accident, credited a supply tech who improvised a fix. He looked where the crew usually sits and let the sightline hold. The gesture told more truth than an anecdote he was perhaps beginning to see laterally. At the edges, two young journalists hunted for quotes. A colonel beside them whispered the order of march. Applause formed in advance, measured and tidy. The house lights warmed a fraction. When Dorian reached the sentence that sends a class forward, he paused. A thin pause, the kind before a confession or a bridge. His gaze found me. I don't know whether someone pointed or the room retuned him, but his eyes landed, blinked, stayed. There was no plea in it, no theater, only acknowledgement. He held it for a beat you cannot counterfeit, then turned back to the hall. Some of my best lessons came from leaders who never asked for the stage. The line wasn't on his paper. It fell with the soft weight of truth. A murmur passed through the candidates, the electricity of recognition. Celine's shoulders eased. Malcolm's chin dipped once as if a ledger balanced by a single entry. Pins came out in gleam and oath. Names were called, hands shaken. I stayed in the back, counting breaths, letting the ritual move like good weather. Respect lives there, quiet, durable, building its own archive. A snare tapped the cadence. A chair leg clicked like punctuation. When the notes faded, I rose with the crowd and kept anonymity by choice. Dorian looked again toward the rear as applause ebbed. The distance between us did not feel like a wall. It felt like a span being measured for a bridge. I did not wave. I did not mouth anything that could be mistaken for performance. I held the simplest answer a body can give attention without demand. Somewhere above the vents, flag cords ticked softly like distant rigging, a detail only the back row hears and keeps. Respect is patient. It counts minutes, not headlines, and returns to its seat even when cameras wander. I stayed still and let that patience redraw the room's scale. The lights cooled to a quiet hush. A storm averted never earns medals, but it saves lives. The command center kept its own weather steady hum, cool air light that refused drama. Displays mapped the Pacific in layered blues. Status bars crept. A printer sighed. I stood at the central console with a stylus I rarely used for pointing, mostly for thinking. Around me, analysts traded low sentences and time-stamps, a language that steps around panic. Reports arrived like tide. From the Eastern Corridor, convoys on schedule, no unsafe approaches, fishing clusters aligned with season. From the straight probes detected and misled hostile chatter thinning like fog. NATO liaisons moved from screen to screen with the focus of bridge officers at dusk. A junior analyst slid a tablet to me. Updated corridor metrics, Admiral. The graphs showed what good work looks like, lines that flatten where heat once lived. My eyes found the anomaly lanes, places where chaos buys a foothold. The lanes were empty not by luck, but by design. I initialed the review, then waited to sign. Waiting is part of command. It keeps the whole from outrunning its evidence. Holt stepped in without clearing his throat. He carries presence the way some men carry weight. Status stable across all sectors, I said. Electronic harassment at nuisance level. Deterrence is holding without friction. He studied the main board a breath. From here, the map looked simple the way oceans do from orbit. We both knew what the simplicity cost. He angled his head approval without theater. You redefined deterrence. The sentence landed softer than praise and heavier than a medal. Okinawa rose in memory, the faint tooth under the map, a freighter spared because we moved decimals instead of ships. Then and now, victory was the absence of noise. Roll the 72-hour projection, I said. Icons marched, paused, resumed as the model adjusted. Analysts called confirmations a repeat, fooled on cue. A probe rerouted toward a phantom. A partnership reported uneventful passage where it had braced for tailing. One liaison asked about rules of engagement. I answered with brevity that left no ambiguity. Calm doesn't survive vagueness. Calm survives because everyone knows which inch belongs to which hand. Holt drifted to the peripheral stations, checking that edges held. When he returned, the room had aligned around a spine. Sign it, he said. Let the record say what was made possible by restraint. I signed with my full name, a luxury years had denied. No ceremony followed, no cameras, no ribbon. The printer breathed again. The report slid into the stack. Across the room, a young officer watched me cap the pen. He wore the look of someone witnessing a hinge move. He hesitated, then leaned toward a classmate and whispered almost reverently, "We'll tell our cadets about this day." The words were not for me, and that is why they found their mark. Silence resumed its work. People returned to their stations, to the prosaic arts that keep the ocean from inventing emergencies for politicians to perform. I rested my palm on the console and felt the faint vibration of machines translating vigilance into uneventfulness. I thought of the back row of ribbons that rattle when a body hurries, of the urge to narrate triumph out loud. Then I let the thought go. This was the day I trained for one line item that changes weather. The shift cycled. Coffee cooled. In the dark glass, my uniform looked like a stranger. Then the angle shifted and the face resolved into mine, steadier than I remembered. My phone vibrated small against the console, insisting without drama. Malcolm texts dinner. Sunday. Same table. The same table, but the hierarchy had shifted. Evening pooled in the windows like warm tea. The Winslow dining room wore its Sunday gloss mahogany, catching chandelier light bowls, breathing steam, the long runner ironed flat as a runway. I took the same chair and felt it differently, as if the wood had learned my weight. Dorian arrived with plates in both hands and no performance. His ribbons slept in a closet. Malcolm squared the napkins without inspecting anyone's spine. Celine set down bread, then let it be. We made weather from ordinary talk, at first beltway traffic, a neighbor's sump pump peonies refusing the calendar. I heard the quiet between remarks and recognized it as space, not absence. The first time I mapped a coastline, I learned to read gaps as shape. Families are coastlines too. Malcolm cleared his throat, newly sanded of command. How is your Pacific team? There was nothing to prove in the question, only curiosity. I spoke about rotations and liaisons, about corridors held calm because edges were understood. He listened like a man learning a tool in his own garage, careful of the bite. Celine surprised herself by asking about schedules. Do you sleep? Half jest, half real. Enough, I said. The work doesn't reward exhaustion. It rewards attention. She nodded and let quiet sit, not rushing to gild it. Dorian poured water, careful not to flood anyone's glass. His glance brushed mine, returned, stayed. I've been reading after-action packets, he said, as if confessing. There's a lot I didn't see. I could have told him the exact weight of a lot. I chose a smaller sentence. Seeing is a discipline, I said. It grows if you train it. Aurelia, 15 and allergic to ceremony, leaned her elbows on the table until Malcolm tapped them down. She ignored the tap long enough to look at me head on. Aunt Alara, do you really command ships? Her voice made the question sound like a dare for both of us. Steam curled from the roast. Somewhere a timer clicked and went quiet. I set my fork down and let the room steady. And people. The words did not land like thunder. They settled, present proportioned, and altered the room's gravity by degrees. In the mirror over the sideboard, I saw a table that looked unchanged, and felt remade chairs in the same places, stories in different voices. Dorian adjusted his posture by a notch that was not for show. Selene smiled without offering a script. Malcolm's hand rested for once, palm down. We passed dishes in a cadence no one narrated. Aurelia asked about signals and storms, and I explained just enough that seas can be taught patience, that silence is a tool if you choose it, that presence is a promise you keep with your back as much as with your mouth. She listened not as a child at a pageant, but as a person measuring a life she might want. Outside, cicadas stitched the dusk. The house exhaled. I remembered the brunch when laughter pressed me to the rim of my teacup. Tonight the tea sat undisturbed, and still it warmed my hands. Not triumph, alignment. Dorian took the dishes unprompted. Malcolm told a quick story about his first ship that did not center himself. Selene asked whether the stars are heavy. Only when you forget why you wear them, I said, and no one corrected the plural. We cleared, stacked, rinsed. The ordinary made its claim and for once felt noble. The same table, the new order. We lingered a moment longer, eased. Aurelia grins. That's kind of badass. Justice isn't a roar. It's the quiet that remains after. The apartment carried the hush of late hours, blinds half drawn, one lamp keeping its post over the desk. The city murmured at a distance, tires on wet asphalt, an occasional siren swallowed by the dark. My uniform hung on the back of the chair, shoulders squared even without me inside. I sat in a sweater worn soft at the elbows, hands on the velvet case that had followed me through decades. I opened it. The two silver stars rested where I had left them, their shine patient, their weight unchanged. I lifted each one, listened for the click memory kept, then set them back down in the fabric that understood waiting. Presence isn't what the world sees, it's what survives when no one is looking. The laptop blinked its notifications into the quiet. I let them gather, then clicked one open. Subject line, invitation, Naval Academy Spring Keynote. The body was spare. Justice isn't comfort, it's clarity. We'd like you to speak to the graduating class. I read the line twice, 3 times until it dissolved into the walls. Justice isn't comfort. It never had been. Beside the keyboard sat the framed photo. Dorian and I, outside the Pentagon uniforms, pressed his arm across my shoulder. No podium, no medals, no audience, just siblings in the open air. His smile tentative, almost private. Mine steady, learned. I traced the edge of the frame with one finger and felt the grain where glass meets wood. The apartment smelled of paper and steel, faint echoes from rooms I once lived inside for months. I let the memories step in quietly. The black room, the corridor hum the first time an ensign saluted me without knowing why. Faces of comrades I hadn't seen in years floated at the edge of the lamplight. Not ghosts, witnesses. I leaned back. The screen's glow touched my face like an oath repeated. You don't outshout a lie, I whispered to the quiet. You outlast it. The words carried no volume yet. They filled the room like tide fills a bay, inevitable, precise. I closed the velvet case and slid it into the drawer. The lamp switch clicked. Darkness took the walls, but the laptop still glowed steady and clear. On the screen, one word waited, typed earlier, and left open the only word I wanted to leave behind: presence. Justice isn't a roar. It's the quiet that remains after. I kept the apartment dim and let the laptop mark out a square of blue on the desk, a small C that did not move. Outside, traffic breathed. Inside, the air chose stillness. I set the velvet case before me and traced its seam with a thumb that remembered other edges, charts, rails, the ridge of a folder I never signed. The hinges yielded. 2 stars waited in their dark, the metal exact, patient, refusing to beg for light. I lifted them, felt the cool weight remind my palm that rank is a verb, not jewelry, then nested each back into velvet until the fabric accepted their outline. On the shelf, the photograph watched Dorian and me outside the Pentagon, his arm around my shoulder, my hand loose at my side. No salute, no theater, just a geometry corrected at last. I held the frame and let memory trim the week to what mattered, the wave of salutes rising like orderly weather, the brief hallway where we spoke without costumes, the text from our father that arrived like a door quietly unlocked. The inbox chimed. Naval Academy, keynote. I opened the note and found a single sentence that fit the room as if it had been measured here. Justice isn't comfort. It's clarity. The words aligned my breath the way a helmsman aligns a bow to current. No struggle, just agreement. They were not asking for a performance. They were asking for a kind of presence that teaches others to hold a line. I replied with a time and a spare acceptance. Messages stacked under it, congratulations, requests, camera angles. I let them wait. The right work is never harmed by a short delay. I rinsed a cup, dried it, returned it to its ring on the desk, as if placing a buoy back where charts expect it. Presence is a discipline. It keeps the hand steady when the headline tries to set the rudder. Presence is the refusal to spend truth like fireworks. It is the long count, assess, decide, act, review, then breathe and repeat. I laid my palms flat and felt the grain of the wood answer with its own patience. I thought of the first names I ever traced on brass: Rear Admiral Yvonne Davis, Captain Elise Tran, Commander Harper James, and of how endurance can be handed down in silence without ever being lessened. No portraits, only standards. Do the work. Let the work speak. Keep the water calm. I opened a blank document and sketched a list for the midshipmen: what precision asks of pride, how trust is stored and spent, when to hold a room with stillness rather than volume. Another ping: logistics for the keynote hall hour sequence of colors. I made one correction, closed the thread, and let the screen dim to a horizon. The apartment felt like the black room remade, not secret, simply spared of noise. I crossed to the window and watched a street lamp paint the sidewalk into 2 clear lanes. A couple walked the border without noticing it existed. Back at the desk, I opened the case again, not to admire, but to put the stars where they belong, when not in use. Ready, secure, undesperate. The photo borrowed a quiet glow from the laptop and gave it back in steadiness. I leaned close and let the sentence I owed the week find air. You don't outshout a lie, you outlast it. The words did not echo. They didn't need to. They settled like ballast and made the room level. One last itinerary slid into the inbox, pretending certainty. I smiled at its confidence and dismissed it. I lowered the lid of the laptop until its thin light was a strip across the desk, a sea line you steer by when weather argues with nerve. She switches off the light, leaving only the screen glowing the word presence. I carried silence for years, letting others take the credit, letting their noise drown out my presence. But when the moment finally came, I stood not for applause, but for truth. If my journey resonates with you, leave a comment telling me what part struck you most or what you would have done in my place. Your voices remind me that resilience matters. And remember this: in your own life, you don't have to shout to prove your worth. Keep building, keep believing, and when the right moment arrives, your quiet strength will speak louder than any roar.